The Rose City at dawn, the first light of day slid over the high cliffs of Petra like molten gold, catching the edges of the carved facades and pulling them awake from the night's shadow. The rock itself glowed in shades of rose, orange, and pale honey, each curve and pillar sculpted centuries before by Nabatean hands. The narrow passage of the sick Petra's winding gorge was still in shadow, its towering sandstone walls cool to the touch, smelling faintly of dust and the ghost of last night's chill. From within that shadow, a caravan emerged. 2 camels walked first, their long legs moving with the slow rhythm of creatures that knew how to conserve strength. Behind them came a lean, dark-eyed man named Zaid, his keffiyeh wrapped loosely over his head, the tail ends flapping softly in the morning breeze. His robe was the beige of desert sand, unremarkable among merchants, and his sandals had long since molded to his feet, from years of travel between the Red Sea and the Levant. The camels carried large pottery jars tied with braided rope. Anyone glancing at them would think they were heavy with olive oil, the sort every household in Petra bought by the amphibra. In truth, each jar did hold oil, but only as a shallow cover. Beneath that layer rested nuggets of frankincense from the southern reaches of Arabia, resin so pure that Roman markets in Damascus and Antioch would pay a king's ransom for it. The catch: the Romans taxed all such goods heavily. The Nabatean kingdom was officially a client state of Rome now, and every jar of incense was supposed to be registered and levied. Zaid had no intention of letting the empire's ledgers get fatter from his labor. The sick widened into a small open space, and there, like a vision, stood Al-Khaznatha treasury, its columns and pediment carved directly into the mountain's face. Even Zaid, who had walked past it 100 times, felt that small pull of awe. The air smelled faintly of baking bread from the market ahead, mingled with the temps of camel sweat and the spice-laden breath of the city awakening. He passed under a Nabatean arch where 2 guards in crimson cloaks lounged, their spears resting in the crook of their elbows. They gave him a cursory glance. It was not them he feared. The Nabatean kingdom had long tolerated smuggling, so long as it kept wealth circulating among its own people. It was the Roman patrols with their strict records, their foreign tongue, and their cold calculating eyes that could ruin a man. The marketplace was beginning to stir. Merchants were setting out bolts of dyed cloth, their colors startling in the morning sun, deep indigo from the Phoenician coast, saffron yellow from distant lands. Women in long dresses and headscarves bargained for baskets of figs, while a baker pounded dough on a flat table dusted with flour. A boy ran past with a bundle of rushes for weaving mats, and an old man called out the day's news in a sing-song voice, most of it gossip from caravans that had arrived the night before. Zaid guided his camels toward the oil seller's quarter. Here, the air was thick with the smell of pressed olives, the green-gold liquid shimmering in shallow vats. He moved carefully, his gaze skimming the edges of the square for a particular set of helmets, the segmented bronze of Roman legionaries. He spotted none yet, but knew they would appear soon. It was a game of timing. He would store his camels in the oil seller's yard, keeping the jars sealed. When the Roman tax officers came through, they would see only a merchant's load of oil, nothing more. The trick was to avoid attracting any reason for them to pierce the surface and find the resin hidden below. As he unloaded the first jar, a voice reached him, soft, low, yet carrying in the hush of morning. Zaid ibn Harith. He turned sharply. Few used his full name, fewer still knew it here. The speaker was a woman, her face veiled in a gauzy scarf of desert blue, her eyes a pale amber that caught the sunlight like trapped fire. She stood beside a pottery stall, one hand resting lightly on the rim of a jar, as if she were merely another customer. "You have me at a disadvantage," Zaid said cautiously. "I don't recall your name." "You will," she replied, and without another word, she stepped into the shadowed side street that wound deeper into the market's tangle. Something in her tone, in the surety of her movement, told him she expected him to follow. Zaid glanced around. No Romans yet, no Nabatean guards, paying him mind. He tugged lightly on the camel's rope, tethering the beasts to the oil seller's post, and slipped after her. The alley was narrow, smelling faintly of coriander from a spice stall nearby. The woman stopped in a patch of shade where 2 walls met, the noise of the main market muffled here. She reached into the folds of her robe and withdrew a small roll of parchment, sealed with a lump of hardened resin. "What is it?" Zaid asked. "A map," she said. 2 wells. The Romans do not know of wells that would let a caravan cross the long stretch between here and Gaza without stopping at any of their checkpoints. He felt a spark of interest and caution. Such a route would make him and anyone else using it untouchable by Roman taxation. But it could also make him a target for both Rome and any Nabatean rivals, who depended on Roman goodwill. "And why offer it to me?" he asked. "Because you deal in goods Rome wants to count, and you have the skill to make sure they never do." Her amber eyes held his without flinching. "The map is yours for 3 jars of the frankincense you hide so carefully." Zaid smiled faintly. "You assume much. I assume only what I know." She tucked the parchment back into her robe. "Think on it, merchant. The desert is a harsher enemy than Rambut. It can also be the greatest ally. Before he could reply, she stepped past him and vanished into the bright spill of sunlight at the alley's end, leaving only the faint scent of myrrh in her wake. Zaid stood for a long moment in the shadow, listening to the marketplace beyond. Somewhere, the first Roman voices had begun to cut through the hum of the city, firm-clipped, already demanding accounts. He adjusted his robe, returned to his camels, and began the slow work of looking like an honest man with nothing to hide. But the image of that parchment, and the promise it carried, had already taken root in his mind. Roman gatekeepers by mid-morning. The marketplace had become a living river of color and sound. Merchants shouted over one another in Nabatean, Aramaic, and Greek, their voices blending into a hum that rose and fell like the wind over dunes. Donkeys brayed, goats bleated, the smell of roasting lamb drifted on the air. And somewhere, a hammered brass bell rang with sharp insistence. If you are enjoying this story, I would really appreciate you to like, subscribe, and comment from where are you listening from. Zaid stood at his stall, the camels resting in the shade behind him, their long lashes blinking lazily. He'd stacked his jars of supposed olive oil neatly in a corner, their mouths sealed with pitch, and their sides coated in the dust of the road to make them look well-traveled but unremarkable. But the moment he saw them, the pulse in his throat ticked faster. 2 Roman legionaries in their segmented larica armor, polished to a dull gleam in the sun. And between them, a tax officer wearing the white-bordered crimson cloak of Rome's provincial administration. His scroll case hung from his belt, and a wax tablet was tucked into the crook of his arm. They moved with the certainty of men who knew their authority was unshakable here. The crowd parted for them not with fear, exactly, but with the weariness of people used to submitting. The tax officer, a square-jawed man with a face like a hawk's beak, stopped at the first merchant's stall. He opened the wax tablet, asked questions in a clipped Greek, jotted notes, moved on. The soldiers kept a watchful eye on the good silks from Tyre, figs from Jericho, spices from southern Arabia, lifting lids, sniffing contents, testing weights. Zaid forced his breathing to slow. If he showed even a flicker of unease, it would draw them like flies to honey. By the time they reached him, the officer's expression had not softened. "Your name?" the officer asked in Greek. "Zaid ibn Harith," he replied in the same tongue, bowing his head slightly. "What is your trade?" "Oil merchant," Zaid said smoothly, gesturing toward his jars. "Pressed in the groves east of Aqaba." The officer stepped forward, brushing his fingers over the nearest jar. "Open one." Zaid's mind raced. The pitch seal was intact. Breaking it would reveal the thin layer of olive oil and below it, the dull, amber lumps of frankincense resin. If the officer stirred too deep, he would see everything. He forced a smile. Of course. He knelt, took a small knife from his belt, and pried the seal loose. The smell of fresh oil rose at once, rich and green. Zaid reached into his pack, pulled out a ladle, and dipped it into the jar, letting the golden liquid spill into a small earthen cup. The officer sniffed the oil, nodded. "Pour it into my hand." Zaid obeyed, the oil sliding like liquid sunlight over the man's palm. The officer rubbed it between his fingers, checked for grit or rancidness, then wiped his hand on the hem of a passing slave's tunic without looking. "Good," the officer said. "Seal it again." Relief brushed the edges of Zaid's mind, but then the officer tilted his head slightly. "You travel alone." "No," Zaid lied without missing a beat. "2 of my brothers have taken a second route, bringing dates and barley. We meet in Gaza." One of the soldiers leaned closer to the camels, nostrils flaring. "I smell incense," he said in Latin, which Zaid understood well enough. The officer frowned. "Incense?" Zaid chuckled lightly. "From my robe, perhaps my neighbor in Aqaba works the incense trade. It clings to cloth." The officer's eyes narrowed, measuring him. For a moment, Zaid thought he might order the jars overturned. But then the taxman's attention was drawn away by a loud dispute at the next stall. 2 traders accusing each other of selling stolen Roman cloth. Without another word, the officer waved his soldiers onward, and they disappeared into the crowd. Zaid let his breath out slowly, the muscles in his shoulders loosening. He resealed the jar and set it back with the others, wiping his palms discreetly against his robe. But his relief was short-lived. From the corner of his eye, he caught a flicker of blue, the same desert blue veil as the woman from earlier, Samira, slipping between 2 fabric stalls. She didn't look at him, but the timing was too exact, too precise, to be coincidence. Was she following him more? Was she making sure the Romans didn't linger? Either way, the map she carried now burned in his thoughts more than the incense hidden in his jar. The woman with the map, the market's midday heat pressed down like a heavy hand. The air shimmered faintly above the stone-paved square, and even the goats tethered in the shade had gone still, their tails twitching only to swat at lazy flies. Traders fanned themselves with palm fronds, and the scent of sun-warmed spice cinnamon, cumin, and the sharp bite of cardamom rose from the stalls in thick waves. Zaid stayed seated on a low stool beside his jars, his eyes never still. He had the calm posture of a man at ease, but every movement around him was weighed and measured. He had seen the blue-veiled woman Samira vanish into the Warrena valleys to the east. He half expected her to appear again, and half wished she wouldn't. By the time the Roman tax party had moved out of sight entirely, The crowd began to thicken again. Traders pushed forward with their wares. Gossip resumed its steady hum, and the clink of coin returned like the city's true heartbeat. Zaid sold 2 small flasks of oil, answered a handful of casual inquiries, and waited. She found him when the noise was at its loudest. "Come," Samira said quietly from behind him. He turned, but she had already started walking, her steps purposeful yet unhurried, weaving between a stack of amphorae and a pair of musicians tuning their lutes. Zaid hesitated, glanced at his camel safe for now, under the oil seller's watchhand, followed. They left the market square and slipped into the covered passage between 2 buildings. It was cooler here. The sun, reduced to thin strips of light filtering through wooden slats above the air, carried the scent of old rope, dry straw, and the faint sweetness of stored dates. "You seem to appear only when I am close to trouble," Zaid said, his tone a blend of humor and suspicion. "Perhaps trouble is what makes you worth finding," she replied without turning. They emerged into a shaded courtyard, quiet except for the rustle of a fig tree in the center. A stone bench curved along one wall, and Samira sat, gesturing for him to do the same. She reached into her robe and produced the parchment again, holding it between her fingers without yet offering it. "This map," she began, "is older than the Romans here. It was drawn when the Nabateans were still masters of all the incense roads. Some of the wells it marks are dry now, but 3 still run, and none are in Roman records." Zaid leaned forward slightly. She smiled faintly. "You think I will tell you without payment? I am not foolish. You asked for 3 jars. He said, "That is worth more than a fine house in Petra. Why should I trust that the ink on that parchment is worth the price?" Samira turned the scroll slowly in her hands. "Because you smuggle incense the way a scribe hides meaning in riddles, and you do it well. But you are bound to the Romans' roads, their gates, their taxes. This could change that. A path from Aqaba to Gaza in less than 20 days, through lands so barren, no patrol would bother to ride it, unless they knew where to drink." Her words struck him harder than he'd expected. A route like that would cut his costs by half and his risks by more than that. No bribes, no false seals, no desperate plays like the one he'd made this morning. "And what do you gain?" he asked. "A share in the profit, later, and the knowledge that Rome is not all-seeing." She glanced at the scroll, then back at him. 3 jars now, the rest, when you have walked the route and returned alive." Zaid studied her. Her eyes held no flicker of doubt, but there was something else, a guardedness that made her difficult to read. He had dealt with traitors, thieves, and spies before. She carried a little of each in her. "Why me?" he pressed. "Because you are careful enough not to be caught, and bold enough to want what this offers." She extended the scroll now, holding it halfway between them. Zaid didn't take it yet. "And if I say no?" Samira's expression didn't change. "Then you will keep dodging tax collectors until one day your jars are broken open, and your fortune spills into their hands. I will find another buyer." They sat in silence for a moment, the breeze shifting the fig leaves overhead. Somewhere in the distance, the deep call of a water seller echoed through the streets. Zaid finally reached forward, taking the scroll. It was lighter than he expected, the parchment dry but well preserved. The seal of resin was old but intact. He slipped it inside his robe without breaking it. "You'll have your jars tonight," he said. Samira stood smoothly. "Then I'll have your trust tomorrow." She started toward the courtyard's exit, her sandals whispering against the stone. At the archway, she paused and looked back. "Do not open it here," she said. "Petra has many ears, and some of them are Roman." And then she was gone, leaving Zaid with the faint scent of myrrh again, and a knot of possibilities and dangers tightening in his chest. Desert-packed, the sun had dropped low enough to turn Petra's cliffs into molten copper. Shadows lengthened across the market, cooling the air by degrees, though the stone beneath Zaid's sandals still held the heat of the day. The bustle had thinned. Merchants rolled up dyed cloth, tied leather covers over baskets of dates, and herded the last of their goats into pens. Zaid moved with purpose. He stopped only long enough to retrieve 3 jars from his camels, each one heavier than it looked, and slipped them into a wicker-lidded basket. He covered them with a folded wool blanket that smelled faintly of cedar. The oil seller, a man named Harun, with a belly like a water jar, glanced at the basket. "Late delivery, a gift," Zaid replied. "For a business partner," Harun chuckled. "You have too many partners, Zaid." "Not enough," Zaid said, and left before more questions could follow. He made his way through the narrowing lanes toward the city's eastern edge. The stone walls gave way to carved facades fading into rough cliffside, and then the Sick again, its high walls blushing in the last light. Beyond the Sick, the desert spread out in ripples of golden shadow. She was waiting for him there. Samira stood beside a kneeling camel, its harness decorated with small brass bells that tinkled when the breeze shifted. Her veil was drawn back this time, revealing the sharp line of her jaw and the determined set of her mouth. She wore a traveler's robe the color of sand, belted at the waist with a strip of braided leather. "You came," she said, her gaze flicking to the basket in his hands. "You doubted?" "I never doubt," she said, though her eyes hinted otherwise. Do you have them? Zaid set the basket on the ground and lifted the blanket, revealing the jars. 3. As agreed. Samira crouched to inspect them, running her fingers along the seals. She didn't open them. She didn't need to. The faint resin-sweet aroma clung even through the pitch. And the map? Zaid asked. She stood and reached into her satchel, drawing out the parchment scroll. This time, she handed it to him without hesitation. The resin seal caught the last sliver of sunlight before slipping into shadow. Do not break it until you are beyond the city, she said. There are men here in Abotian and Roman who would kill to possess this. Zaid slipped the scroll into the inner pocket of his robe. You speak as if I am not already in danger. Samira's expression softened, just slightly. Danger is a matter of distance. In Petra, it is the length of a shadow. In the open desert, it is the span of a horizon. They walked together, away from the city, their footsteps crunching over the gravelly ground. The desert wind picked up, carrying the scent of sagebrush. Behind them, Petra was a glow of orange light between the cliffs, its noise fading into silence. Tell me, Zaid said after a time, how you came by this map. Samira's eyes stayed on the horizon. My father was a caravan master. He knew routes others thought impossible. When Rome's reach grew, many such routes were abandoned to keep peace. Before he died, he gave me this map and told me to guard it until I found someone willing to use it, and you chose me. I watched you in the market. You lie well without seeming to, and you don't let fear slow your hands. She glanced at him. Also, you are not yet rich enough to grow complacent. That matters. Zaid smirked faintly. Flattery or insult? A warning, she said simply. They reached a low ridge where the sand dipped into a shallow wadi. The camel knelt and Samira began loading the jars into its pan. Zaid noticed she handled them as if they were not only valuable but dangerous, each movement deliberate, careful not to jostle. When the last jar was stowed, she turned to him. The first well is 3 days east. If you find it, you'll know the others are real. If you don't, she'll let the sentence trail off. And you? I have my own caravan to lead, she said. We travel different paths. Something in her tone told him she would not reveal more. They stood in silence for a moment, the sky deepening into indigo above them. Stars began to appear, sharp and cold in the dry air. Zaid, she said finally, be careful. The desert is not only sand and thirst. There are men who would see you dead rather than free of their control. I've met such men, he replied. Not like these. She mounted her camel in one smooth motion, the bells on its harness chiming. With a nod, she turned eastward, the animal's long legs carrying her into the gathering night. Zaid watched until the shape of her and the camel blurred into the darkness. Then he turned back toward Petra, the map pressing against his ribs like a hidden heart. In the market the next morning, Petra woke beneath a sky, the color of pale copper, the heat already simmering in the air. Zaid rose early, the map still tucked deep in his robe, its sealed parchment, a weight he was constantly aware of. He had not opened it, not yet. Not while the city's walls and its watchful eyes pressed in on him from every side. The market was already stirring when he arrived. He led his camels through the narrow alleys. Past bread sellers fanning the coals under their flat griddles. Past women with baskets of pomegranates so red they seemed to hold the sunrise inside them. The sounds of the city were deceptively familiar, wooden wheels creaking, traders calling in a dozen tongues, the jangle of coins, but beneath the normal hum, he caught something else. A sharper note, a tension like the string of a bow pulled too tight. It wasn't long before he found the source. Near the spice quarter, 2 Roman soldiers stood at a stall, their helmets catching the morning lights. They were speaking to the stallkeeper in low, clipped tones. But Zaid caught enough of the Latin to piece together their meaning. A Nabatean merchant carries state property, map stolen from the governor's archives. The map in his robe seemed to grow heavier, its presence now edged with danger. He slipped into the shade of a linen seller's awning and pretended to examine the rolls of cloth. From there, he could watch without being obvious. The soldiers finished their conversation and moved on, their armor clinking softly. Behind them, the stallkeeper muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Zaid's mind was already racing. If the Romans were speaking openly about a stolen map, it meant 2 things. They knew it existed, and they were certain it was in Petra. Whether they knew he had it was another matter, but in Petra's close web of traders, whispers traveled faster than caravans. He moved deeper into the market, avoiding the main square. Every voice seemed to carry fragments of his danger. Heard it's worth more than a caravan of gold. 3 wells, untouched for 100 years. Roman patrols tightening near the gates. Some of these whispers were almost certainly exhortations. Some might have been planted by the Romans themselves to draw him out. It didn't matter. The truth was bad enough. At the far end of the incense quarter, he ducked into the small courtyard of a tea house. It was dim inside, the air thick with the scent of mint and cinnamon. Only a handful of patrons sat scattered on the low benches, most of them older men hunched over cups of steaming brew. Zaid took a place in the corner, where he could see the door. He ordered tea and waited, the steam curling in front of his face. He needed to think. The map had to leave Petra with him. Keeping it here was as good as handing it to the Romans. But leaving now, in daylight, would mean passing the gates under the gaze of the very men hunting for it. He was still turning over the problem when a shadow fell across his table. "Your tea will go cold." Samira slid onto the bench opposite him, her veil drawn up again, her eyes scanning the room before settling on him. "You know, don't you?" Zaid asked quietly. "That the Romans are looking for you." "Yes, they've posted word to search all caravans leaving within the next 2 days. You didn't think to warn me before I walked straight into their arms." Her expression didn't change. "I wanted to see how you would react. A man's first move in danger tells me more than his words." Zaid leaned back, his tea untouched. "And what did you see?" "That you are careful," she said, "but not careful enough to be invisible." Her words stung, though he didn't let it show. "Then perhaps you have advice. Stay in the city until the search cools," she said, "or leave tonight when the gates are less watched." "Leave tonight," Zaid repeated, "and ride straight into the desert, with the map they already know exists." Samira's gaze sharpened. "Unless you plan to hand it to them." For a long moment, they studied each other over the rim of the cooling tea. Zaid thought again of the wells marked on the parchment, the freedom they promised. The risk was great, but so was the prize. "I'll leave tonight," he said at last, "and if the desert takes me, so be it." Samira's mouth curved into the faintest smile. "Then I will see you to the edge." She stood without finishing her tea and slipped out into the sunlit street, leaving him alone with the weight of his choice. That evening, as the market's last light faded and the smell of roasting lamb drifted through the streets, Zaid began making ready. The whispers were no longer just background noise, they were the sound of a net into the wadi. Night fell over Petra like a veil of indigo silk, the stars sharp and cold against the black. The city's hum quieted into scattered voices and the occasional bark of a dog. Lamps glowed faintly in the carved facades, their light swallowed quickly by the shadows of the sick. Zaid moved through those shadows with practiced silence. His camels were laden for travel, the load balanced between legitimate goods: jars of oil, woven mat sand, the one thing that could change his life, the sealed parchment pressed against his ribs. Every step out of Petra was a step further from Roman reach, or so he told himself. The eastern gate loomed ahead, its stone pillars catching just enough moonlight to reveal the outline of a guard. The man leaned against his spear, eyes half-lidded in the kind of boredom that came just before dawn. Two others sat by a low brazier, murmuring to each other, the glow of coals lighting their faces in flickers. Zaid slowed his approach, keeping to the edge of the torchlight. If he passed too quickly, it might look suspicious. Too slowly, and they might take the time to inspect his load. He chose the pace of a man whose only goal was to make camp before the night grew colder. The first guard lifted a hand. "Where bound?" East, Zaid replied in the Nabatean tongue. "To meet my brothers before the caravan to Gaza." The man eyed the camels but didn't rise. "You travel light for Gaza." Zaid gave a small shrug. "I trade in oil, not stone. My brothers carry the rest." For a moment, he thought the guard might insist on checking the jars. But a burst of laughter from deeper inside the gate drew the man's attention, and he waved Zaid through with little more than a grunt. Once past the gate, Zaid didn't allow himself to look back. The desert opened before him in quiet waves, the sand pale under the moon. He led the camels away from the road, toward a narrow path he knew well, one that would carry him into Wadi Rum, the valley of sandstone towers and hidden wadis where the wind itself seemed to speak. By midnight, the sounds of Petra had faded completely. The only noises were the soft crunch of camel hooves in the sand and the occasional rattle of a harness ring. Above, the stars blazed in such numbers they seemed to press down on the earth, bright enough to cast faint shadows. The further he traveled, the more the air cooled, carrying the scent of sage and dry stone. The moonlight painted the sandstone cliffs in ghostly silver, their shapes shifting into towers, gates, and creatures in his mind's eye. He was deep into the wadi when he caught the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves behind him. Zaid halted, tilting his head. The sound stopped, then resumed, closer now. He moved the camels off the path and into the shadow of a rock outcrop, pressing his body to the cool stone. Moments later, 3 riders passed at a gallop. Their silhouettes were dark against the pale sand, but the glint of a helmet caught in the moonlight betrayed them Romans. The lead rider carried a short spear, the others swords, bade in slow, riding eastward, dust rising in their wake. Zaid waited until the sound of their hooves had dissolved into the night. His heartbeat was steady again before he moved the camels back onto the path. He didn't know if they had been sent for him specifically, but he couldn't risk meeting them again. Samira's warning echoed in his mind. The desert is not only sand and thirst, there are men who would see you dead. He pressed onward, guiding the camels through a narrow pass between 2 sheer cliffs. The wind funneled through here, carrying a low, hollow moan. In the moonlight, the rock faces looked almost alive, their surfaces etched with ancient carvings Nabatean script. camels, stars, and what might have been maps to long-forgotten wells. By the time the first faint glow of dawn touched the horizon, Zaid had covered many miles. The air was cold enough that his breath fogged in front of him. He found a sheltered hollow between two boulders, hidden from the main path, and led the camels to kneel. As they settled, he drew the scroll from his robe. The resin seal was still intact, its surface brittle with age. With a small knife, he cracked it, the faint scent of dried sap escaping into the morning air. The parchment unfurled with a whisper, revealing lines drawn in a faded red-brown ink. A series of dots marked wells, connected by thin lines routes across stretches of desert where no man would travel without water. Symbols he didn't recognize dotted the margins, perhaps warnings or measurements. He traced the route with his finger. The first well lay 3 days east, in a dry basin marked with a crescent moon. From there, the path angled northeast, skirting Roman outposts entirely. Zaid rolled the map carefully and tucked it away again. Ahead lay danger, yes, but also the kind of freedom he had never dared to imagine. The camels shifted restlessly, and he knew they would need to move again soon. The Romans would not give up quickly, and the desert had a way of exposing anyone who lingered too long in one place. As the sun's rim broke the horizon, casting fire over the endless sand, Zaid led his caravan deeper into the wadi, where the stones swallowed the light, and the path turned toward the lost well. For 3 days, Zaid moved eastward under the punishing rhythm of the desert. The map's faded lines guided him through stretches of barren land, where the sand drifted in long, slow waves, and the wind sang through narrow rock passages like an old flute. The heat of the day could peel the strength from a man's bones. The cold of the night crept into his joints until they ached. By dawn of the 3rd day, his waterskins were dangerously light. The camels drank little, but their eyes had taken on that glassy, restless look that meant thirst was tightening its grip. Zaid's own lips were cracked, and his tongue felt heavy in his mouth. The map showed the well not far ahead, 3 short lines and a crescent moon marking its position in a low basin. He scanned the horizon for any sign of a depression or a cluster of palms, but the land was empty in every direction, the sky so bright it seemed to bleach the world. By midday, he began to wonder if the map had deceived him. Old wells dried, routes shifted, and the desert erased the work of men in a season. But the lines on the parchment had been deliberate, confident, as if the cartographer knew the well's survival was certain. He pressed on, descending into a shallow wadi, where the wind was softer and the air felt marginally cooler. The camel's pace quickened. They smelled something he couldn't yet see. Then, as the wadi curved, the ground dipped sharply. There it was. Half hidden in the shadow of a sandstone outcrop stood a ring of ancient stones, weathered to rounded edges. In the center, a circular mouth opened into darkness. The air around it carried the faint, almost imperceptible scent of moisture, the kind only the desert's truly thirsty could detect. Zaid hurried forward, lowering himself to his knees beside the stone lip. A rope lay coiled there, frayed but still sturdy, tied to a clay bucket that looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. He dropped the bucket down. The rope hissed softly through his hands until it splashed, the sound echoing up from the depths like music. When he hauled it back, the water gleamed pale and clean in the bucket, colder than he'd expected. He drank deeply, the taste earthy and sharp with minerals, then let the camels drink in turn. The animals lowered their heads greedily, slurping until their humps eased and their eyes softened. For the first time since leaving Petra, Zaid felt the knot in his chest loosen. This was more than survival, this was proof. The map was true. If one well remained, perhaps the others did too. With this route, a man could move goods across hundreds of miles without ever touching a Roman-controlled road. As he rested in the shade, he studied the map again. The next well lay northeast, beyond a series of jagged ridges marked with strange triangular symbols. He didn't recognize their meaning, mountains perhaps, or some warning. But the placement of the wells formed a pattern, almost a hidden geometry, and he began to see how the Nabateans had once controlled trade through knowledge alone. The sound of stones shifting snapped him out of his thoughts. He froze, hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. The camels lifted their heads, ears twitching. From behind the sandstone outcrop, a figure emerged, a man in a dust-colored robe, his head wrapped in a faded cloth. He was tall, lean, with skin weathered like leather from the sun. "You travel alone," the man said in Arabic, his tone neither friendly nor hostile. Zaid kept his voice neutral. "Alone travels faster." The stranger's gaze dropped to the well, then to Zaid's camels, their panniers heavy with goods. "This well is not on the Roman maps." "No," Zaid agreed, "and yet here it is." The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "Such a place is worth more than gold. Men have killed for less." "I'm not looking for trouble," Zaid said. "Trouble is not something you always have to look for," the man replied. He crouched, cupped water in his hands, and drank. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the ridges. Moving with the ease of someone who knew the desert like a second skin, Zaid watched until the figure was gone. The encounter left a thin line of unease across his thoughts. The desert was vast, but even here, Alone was a relative term. That night, he made camp near the well, the camels resting in a circle around him. He kept the map close, wrapped in cloth, and slept with one ear tuned to the silence between the wind gusts. The desert was quiet but not empty, and somewhere beyond the horizon, men on horseback might already be riding. The second well was supposed to lie northeast, tucked beyond a chain of jagged ridges that bit into the sky like the teeth of some buried beast. For 2 days, Zaid threaded his caravan through narrow passes and long stony stretches where the wind scraped the ground bare. The camels grew restless, their breathing heavier, and Zaid's own thirst returned in the hot hours. By the time the ridges opened into a shallow valley, the sun was lowering behind them, throwing the land into long shadows. The map said the well was here. But where the parchment marked a circle of water, there was nothing, only sand and cracked earth. Zaid walked the valley floor in widening arcs, scanning for signs. A ring of stones, a darker patch of soil, even the half-buried mouth of a collapsed shaft. Nothing. The map had been perfect so far. Could it be wrong now? A sudden voice broke the stillness. "You're looking in the wrong place." He turned sharply. Samira stood on a low rise at the valley's edge, her robe pulled tight against the wind. Her veil was down, and the fading light caught the curve of her cheek and the steady line of her gaze. "You followed me," Zaid said. "I found you," she corrected, walking down toward him. "And it's a good thing I did. The well you seek is not here, it's been buried for years. The water is trapped below." She gestured to a cluster of boulders at the valley's northern end. Under there, the Nabateans covered it deliberately to keep it from enemies. "It can be opened, but not without tools." Zaid frowned. "And you came with tools?" "No, but I came with something else." She lifted a small bronze whistle from her belt and blew once. No audible sound reached his ears. But moments later, shapes appeared along the ridge. 5 men, each armed with curved swords and riding lean desert horses, descended toward them. Their robes were the same dusty brown as the landscape, their faces hidden behind cloth wraps. Zaid's hand went to his knife, but Samira shook her head. "Don't be foolish. If they wanted you dead, you would be bleeding in the sand already." The riders halted in a loose semicircle. One dismounted, stepping forward. His eyes were the same pale amber as Samira's. "My brother," she said, nodding toward him. "And my partners." Zaid's grip tightened on the knife hilt. "Partners. You sold me this map, I traded you this map." She corrected again. "But trade runs both ways. You have goods, worth more than coin to these men. And you have proven the first well still flows. That makes you valuable." Her brother stepped closer, his gaze fixed on Zaid's camel panniers. 3 jars you gave her in Petra. He said, "There are more here." "Those are mine," Zaid said, evenly. "For now," the man replied. The realization settled like a stone in Zaid's gut. Samira hadn't just been giving him a chance. She had been guiding him along a path she already controlled, testing the map's accuracy at his expense. Every step he'd taken was part of her calculation. "You could have taken the map back in Petra," he said to her, "but then I wouldn't know the truth," she replied. "You've proven it. The first well exists. Now we'll take what we need and open the second and me." "That depends on how wise you are," she said. "Help us, and you'll keep a share. Refuse, and you'll be left here to decide whether the desert is kinder than we are." The wind lifted a curl of her hair, and for a moment, Zaid saw no malice in her eyes, only the clear certainty of someone who had survived by staying 2 moves ahead of everyone else. He glanced at the armed riders, at the distant ridges already sinking into night. He could fight and die now, or he could bide his time. "You'll have my help," he said. Samira's smile was small but genuine. "Good." At first light, we dig. That night, Zaid lay in his blanket beside the camels, the map tucked under his head. The desert was silent but for the soft murmur of the riders' voices around their fire. His trust in Samira was gone, but something else had taken its place. A growing, dangerous resolve. If she thought she could use him, she was not wrong. But he would make sure that before this journey ended, the advantage and the map would belong to him alone. The second well dawn came in bands of pale gold and gray, the air sharp with the night's lingering chill. The valley looked different in the morning, its shadows shorter, the ridges less menacing, but Zaid's unease had not faded. The riders were already stirring, feeding their lean horses fistfuls of dry fodder. Samira stood apart, her veil drawn back, speaking quietly with her brother. Zaid finished tethering the camels, then walked toward the cluster of boulders she'd pointed out the day before. Up close, he could see how they formed an unnatural mound. The stones were too uniform, too carefully placed. Some bore shallow chisel marks, worn by wind but still visible, a hand's work, not nature's. Samira approached, holding a short-handled iron pick. The Nabateans sealed the well to keep it out of enemy hands. They left the surface looking like any other pile of rocks in the desert. "And how do you know it's here at all?" Zaid asked. Her eyes met his briefly. "Because my father buried it." The words hung in the air like the shadow of a vulture. Before Zaid could answer, her brother barked an order in Arabic, and the men dismounted to begin work. Two took picks to the stones while the others rolled the loosened rocks away. The sound rang out in the still morning air, sharp metal on stone, the grunt of exertion, the scrape of stone over sand. Zaid joined in, partly to avoid suspicion, partly to keep close. He needed to see what they uncovered. The first hour yielded little more than dust and small stones. Then, as the sun crept higher, one of the men's picks struck something hollow. They cleared the surrounding rocks quickly, revealing a flat stone slab. Its surface carved with faint symbols, lines radiating from a circle, like the sun. Samira crouched beside it, brushing away grit with her fingers. "This is it," she said softly, "the mouth of the well." Her brother jammed the pick's point into the seam between slab and ground, prying it upward. It shifted reluctantly, a low grinding sound escaping as if the earth resisted giving up its treasure. Together, the men levered it aside, and a breath of cool damp air rose from the darkness below. The well's mouth was perfectly round, lined with ancient masonry. A rope lay coiled inside, its fibers brittle with age. Zaid peered into the shadow, catching the faint glint of water far below. They lowered a bucket, and when it came back up, brimming with clear cold water, the men drank greedily. Samira filled a small skin and offered it to Zaid without a word. He drank, the water shockingly fresh after days of rationed swallows. But even as the relief spread through him, his thoughts worked ahead. If Samira's group now knew exactly where this well lay, they could claim it, guard it, and use it to control the entire route. And that meant the map would be worthless without them. The men began refilling skins and watering the horses. Samira knelt to wash her hands, the water darkening the dust on her fingers. "We camp here tonight," she said to her brother. "The next stretch is long and exposed. We leave at moonrise." Zaid pretended to busy himself with the camels, but he was listening. A night departure meant cooler travel, but it also meant slipping past any Roman patrols under cover of darkness. If she planned to move fast, it was because she knew they weren't the only ones hunting this route. That suspicion became certainty when, in the heat of midday, one of the riders spotted movement on the far ridge. A single figure on horseback stood there, still as a statue, watching them. The sun glinted briefly off something metallic armor. Perhaps then, without hurry, the figure turned and disappeared behind the ridge. Samira's brother swore under his breath. "We were followed." Samira's gaze swept the valley floor. "Then the surrounding cliffs, they'll ride for the next well," she said. "We'll have to outrun them." Zaid kept his expression neutral, but inside he was already weighing the odds. The Romans, or whoever that was, had just tipped the balance. Samira might think she could keep him under her control, but in the chaos of a chase, loyalties shifted and plans unraveled. If he played his hand right, the next stretch of the journey could be his chance to turn the tables. That night, under a cold bright moon, they broke camp. The well lay behind them, its surface sealed again with the slab, hiding its secret until someone returned. The camels and horses moved in near silence, their shadows long on the sand. Ahead, the desert opened wide, and Zaid knew the next move would decide not just who owned the map but who lived to see the end of Gambit. The moon hung low over the desert, a silver coin resting on the horizon. The air was sharp with night cold, the sand pale and ghost-like under its light. Zaid rode near the rear of the caravan, his eyes scanning the darkness behind them. Somewhere out there, the watcher from the ridge might still be following. The camel's steady gait was hypnotic. The only sounds, the soft thud of hooves and the faint creak of leather straps. Samira rode at the front beside her brother, their silhouettes distinct against the ridges. She kept glancing back to make sure the group held together, leader, but also a warden. Zaid knew she didn't trust him. That was fine. Trust was a weakness in the desert. The map burned against his ribs like a hidden ember. Without it, neither Samira's crew nor their pursuers could find the remaining wells with certainty. Without him, Samira could still guess, but not with the precision that made the route valuable. They rode until the moon began to dip westward, the temperature dropping further. Then, faint at first, Zaid caught a sound he'd been listening for all night, the distant drumming of hooves. The riders behind were closing in. He leaned forward, urging his camel subtly faster, drawing nearer to Samira's brother. "We're not alone," he murmured. The man's head snapped toward him, then to the rear. He barked a sharp command, and the caravan surged into a faster pace. Dust swirled around their legs as the camels stretched into longer strides. The pursuers grew clearer, now 3 riders, maybe 4, dark shapes slicing across the moonlit dunes. One carried a spear, the head catching the moonlight like a flash of lightning. Samira called back over her shoulder, "There's a narrow pass ahead. Once we're through, they'll have to slow to follow." It was the opportunity Zaid had been waiting for. The pass she spoke of, a split between 2 sandstone cliffs, would funnel everyone into a single file. In that narrow choke point, chaos could work in his favor. If he could vanish there, slip away unseen, the map would be his alone again. They reached the pass just as the first of the pursuers' shouts reached them. The walls rose high on either side, casting deep shadows even under the moon. The air cooled sharply inside, the sound of hooves echoing off the stone. Zaid eased his camel toward the wall, letting the others pull slightly ahead. His heart pounded not with fear, but with the precise timing of a trader who had learned to seize the single instant when the deal could change. When the shadows deepened, he swung down from the saddle without a word, guiding the camel into a narrow cleft in the rock. The beast hesitated, then followed, vanishing from the main path. A moment later, the rest of the caravan thundered past, followed closely by the shouting riders. Neither group looked his way. The echoes swallowed them as they pushed deeper into the pass. Zaid waited, counting slow breaths, until the noise faded into the distance. Then he led the camel through the cleft, which curved sharply before opening into a smaller side valley. The sand here was untouched, the silence unbroken. He mounted again and turned east, away from both Samira and her pursuers. The map was safe against his chest, and the desert ahead belonged to no one but him. But the desert is never empty. Near dawn, as the horizon bled into rose and gold, Zaid spotted movement ahead to lone figures on camels, waiting. As he approached, one lifted a hand in greeting. It was the stranger he had met at the first, wealthy, tall, lean man with the weathered face. "You found the second well," the man said, not a question. Zaid kept his voice even. "And I'll find the rest." The man's smile was thin. Perhaps you'll need help." Zaid looked past him, to the empty horizon. Help in the desert came with a price. But for now, he had water, a camel, and the map. The rest he could bargain for later. He nodded once, and the man turned his camel eastward. Together, they rode into the rising sun, the dunes stretching ahead like an unwritten ledger. The game was far from over.